Hey, it's Rachel, and before we get into this podcast, I just wanted to give a quick overview of the episode. With this one, we talked to Alexia Vernon, who is amazing in so many ways. And one of the things that she does is she helps people create their signature speeches. So when they go to events or they do kind of TED style talk, she helps them create their presentations. And so, in the beginning and the ending of this podcast, I asked a lot of questions around her personal life, things that she's overcome. Alexia has overcome a lot of different things. She's very inspiring. And then in the middle, I asked just a lot of questions around how to give presentations, things to say, how to harness fear. And so I realized that this podcast might not be applicable to everybody. I think it'll be especially helpful if you do public speaking, if you want to do public speaking, probably be the best for you. And then the beginning and the ending, if you don't, would be the other parts that might be helpful. So just wanted to let you know, because if speaking isn't something that you want to hear about, then maybe other podcasts would be better for you. But if you are into speaking, she just gave really outstanding information that I know I took notes on and I was really excited about. So, all right, here is the interview. My name is Rachel Rofe. I created this show because I wanted to help you see that if you have a choice, you can choose a better life. If you're listening to this podcast, you're in a pretty fortunate position. You have free will, ability to connect to the internet, and access to all kinds of new education. This podcast is meant to help you make the most of your good fortune. We talk with all kinds of people here from all walks of life, because I want you to see that no matter what your situation, there's always a way to create a life that you're proud of. Hello everyone, today we're here with Alexia Vernon. Branded a Moxie Maven by the White House for her unique approach to developing women's voices through her Step Into Your Moxie platform, Alexia has become the go-to expert for helping TEDx speakers, entrepreneurs, executives, online experts, business professionals, educators, and creatives deliver their signature speeches. A motivational speaker focused on heart-centered and high-impact communication, values-driven leadership, and women's empowerment, she not only cultivates the voices of thought leaders, she is one. She scored face time with hundreds of corporate, conference, and college audiences with her keynote speeches and interactive trainings, and is founder of the Las Vegas-based women's leadership program, Influencer Academy. As the co-organizer and co-host of Las Vegas's TEDx Fremont East Women, she possesses a unique understanding of the TED speaking style and what organizers are looking for in prospective speakers. She's also the creator of a first-of-its-kind digital training program for aspiring TED-style speakers, Your Spotlight Talk, and you can dive deep and delicious into her teachings in her Go From Hot Mess to Hotshot Speaker free video training at hotshotspeaker.com. And I actually met Alexia maybe about a month ago through the amazing Jordana Jaffe, who I also recorded a podcast with. And we spent a few hours together, and I just felt an immediate deep connection with her. She's just one of those people that you can just feel really comfortable around, and she's authentic, just speaks her truth with compassion. She's just a really good-hearted person, and just someone that you know you can trust. And to give an example of her character, when I was advertising my event in New York City, she asked me how she could help. And I just asked if she'd be able to tell people about the event. I'd be happy to give her an affiliate link. She immediately was just like, no, I'd love to help, no affiliate link needed. And then she tells me that she pre-scheduled 10 different posts around social media. I'm not just the type of person. She is just so generous and cares so much, and just really an incredible person to know. So I'm very excited about this podcast with her. I know she has so much to share. This is going to be awesome. So thank you so much for being here, Lex.
Oh, thank you so much, Rachel. And I'm so excited. As somebody who's a speaker, I shouldn't be so verklempt so early on, but I am a little bit. Thank you.
So my pleasure. The intention behind A Better Life is to show people that if they have a choice, they can choose a better life. So in that spirit, can you take a minute to share with us some of the things that you're most proud of in your life?
My immediate answer is the family that I've built. And that might sound sort of strange because there's plenty of things that I've done professionally that I'm proud of. And yet when I think about what I want my legacy to be, it is first and foremost being an extraordinary partner and having built that partnership despite some difficult times that we've encountered together and in our own lives and careers, as well as being very present for my daughter. So I had made the decision when I got pregnant that I was going to continue to work at home without childcare. And a lot of people thought I was incredibly crazy, especially as I was in the throes of scaling my business. And yet, wanting to first and foremost be a mom while, of course, still building my business, I'm proud of my ability to have integrated that. In terms of the stuff that I've done in my work, I launched my Influencer Academy. The year-long program actually started when I was 7 months pregnant. So being able to do that successfully and graduate my first cohort while still being in the postpartum stage gives me great joy, as well as just the hundreds of people that I've worked with over the years in terms of helping them birth their spotlight talks. Being responsible for people who are doing bright, beautiful, bold things in the world and helping them make sure that the people who need to hear their ideas get to, that really just makes my heart sing.
Beautiful. And I know you have so many amazing accomplishments, the ones that you've said. Everyone just speaks so highly about you. You have even more things in another bio of yours that I saw, just so much. And with all that, I know that you've really worked hard to get to where you are. You've overcome a lot of things. And so I'd love if you could describe a particularly notable time in your life when you felt like things weren't going the way that you wanted or you felt trapped. I just feel like you're super inspirational. And just kind of what was going on then?
There's so many of them. I'm a pretty happy, well-adjusted person, and yet I really believe that my capacity for joy comes from also my capacity to go through a lot of crappy things that I know are necessary in order for me to get to the next step. But the most recent one really was that I suffered from postpartum depression after the birth of my daughter. I had a really idyllic pregnancy. I felt good. I had lots of energy. Although I packed on some serious pounds, I never worried about it. I loved the body that I was wearing, and I loved that connection that I had to my daughter. And so when she went into fetal distress after I was post-term and I had to be induced, it started a chain reaction of just some very difficult times. My cat, who I'd had since I was 19 years old, died the day that we came home as a family from the hospital. And as I mentioned earlier, I was in the middle of my year-long women's leadership program. I had a session to lead for all the women in that group within 3 weeks of birth, and I found myself shortly after that session that I led on the ground one morning sobbing, feeling like I had made a horrible mistake, which if you'd asked me a month ago to talk about this, I don't think I would be able to, because I was so full of shame that I had chosen to bring a child into the world. I had chosen to do it the way that I had, and that I wasn't happy. And while I now recognize that I had a pretty significant hormonal imbalance, which was catalyzing that whole experience that I was in, that as somebody who helps people, particularly women, find their voice and speak with confidence and competence, that the immediate experience of being a mom, which was a role that was so foreign to me, I think I had maybe held 2 children before I ever held my own, that I lost my voice in it. I didn't trust myself. I didn't feel like I ever put a diaper on right, or that I was frustrated with myself that I couldn't put a car seat in right. I blamed myself when my daughter wouldn't breastfeed, and that what I went through in that experience was pivotal in terms of helping me stay real and honest with the people I work with who might feel like they've lost their voice in their careers, or they don't know how to take what they do online and speak it in the world. And by coming out of that, I feel so much more empathy for people who have their own struggles around their voice. Because while I've had my voice for a while in the public speaking arena, man, I really didn't feel like I had it as a mom for quite a while.
How did you start to get your voice back? I know you recognized that it was part hormonal later on. How did you get to that point? What were you telling yourself? And just, yeah, I'd love to hear more about that journey of where you were to where you are now.
This is a great question, and in some ways so funny that you're asking me today of all days, because shortly before we recorded this, I was on the phone with my husband who's going through a tough time professionally. And he'd said to me, "Hun, what did you say to yourself, if you can remember, in that transition out of the postpartum depression?" Because I did bounce back very quickly. It was almost 48 hours after I publicly said I'm suffering from this that I felt like me again. And there were a couple things. Natural progesterone therapy definitely did wonders. But in terms of the self talk, I'm very clear that once I was able to sleep again, that rather than looking at the things that I was doing wrong, and there were plenty of them, or things that weren't going right, I started congratulating myself mentally for the little things that most people would just take for granted, but that were integral for me building my confidence back up. So if I was exclusively pumping at that time, if I was able to get, only moms will understand this, but 60 milliliters out of a breast versus 30 milliliters, I would say, great job. You are able to provide for your daughter. You have everything that you need. If I was able to figure out a way to get her to stop crying in the middle of the night, I would say, I've got this. I just would start rewarding myself for the little things. And when the inevitable hiccups to success would happen, I would just let them be hiccups and stop replaying that. I tell people a lot when they're trying to master the voice in their head that there's usually three voices most of us have at any given time. It can either be the critic, that voice that says, "You're not smart enough, you're not professional enough, you're not experienced enough, you're not hot enough, you're not something enough." Or we can have that cop voice that says, "It's either good or it's bad. You're right or you're wrong. You can choose A or you can choose B." And it obscures our ability to see that gray, underutilized space between those two poles. Or we can have the voice of the cheerleader in our head that says, "You've got this. You don't need to sleep. Everything's fine." And the truth is that I probably skew towards the cheerleader, but actually, in times of great strife, sometimes the cheerleader isn't right. Because when you feel in the core of your being that either you're not happy or you're struggling, and you just hear that cheerleader parroting, ultimately it just makes you feel guilty for feeling the way you feel, if that makes sense. And so, knowing that this is what I teach, I got really clear that I needed to go back to that fourth voice that I tell my folks that they need to play nicely with, which is the voice of the coach. And the voice of the coach asks questions that typically begin with the word how. How can I make this situation right now perfect? Sometimes it's much subtler. How can I get through this day? Or how can I ensure that I don't need to learn this lesson again? And so I got very conscious of, when fear would come up, just speaking back to it in the voice of the coach with those how questions. And it really, really helped.
How do you apply it when you're teaching people to create their speeches?
Usually, the reason why somebody who is super bright, super gifted, killing it online is not speaking is because of fear. It's not because they don't know how to. I mean, sure, maybe they need a great structure for how to tell their spotlight story and how to find what in the TED community we call their idea worth spreading and integrate it. But typically, it's because they're getting in their own way. So I really will ask them to get clear on, what is the voice that's stopping them? Are they going to the critic that's saying, "I don't have enough experience," or "Nobody's going to want to hear from me"? Are they going to the voice of the cop, which is saying, "You can either speak about creativity or you can speak about freedom. You can't speak about both"? And so they're feeling like they have to fit into some archetype for a speaker that's not them. Or are they the cheerleader? Perhaps they've been speaking a lot and they're winging it. This happens a lot with really successful people. They wing it, and as a result, they don't make the impact that they could make by being a little bit more thoughtful in terms of how they speak. Or perhaps if they're speaking to convert, they're not getting business as a result of their speaking because their offers are muddy. So helping them get clear and then inviting them in to ask the questions with the how, so that they are able to get out of their own way and birth the talk that they were put on this earth to be able to give.
Mm. Helpful. That's very helpful. I'm curious, have you noticed any other reasons why people have a hard time speaking? And I'm asking with the context that I have a friend once who she does some vocal lessons for people, and she said one big pattern that she saw with people is that a lot of those who were afraid to speak up were their singing voice was laughed at as a child. I'm curious if you found any like funny little patterns like that too.
Not specifically their singing voice, but, and it's a huge but, usually they've had some horrific experience from speaking their truth. I know that's why I was drawn to this work, because I could write an entire book of the times when I played it safe and small or spoke up and it didn't lead to the results that I wanted it to lead to. And so I vowed that I was never going to put myself in a vulnerable position again. And I found that that is really common, particularly for women. They've either had that experience firsthand, or perhaps they've been privy to watching it happen to somebody else and said, oh, if that happened to her, if that happened to him, it could happen to me. So therefore, I better not do it. One of the key areas where that happens is when people tend to have a lot of emotion, which is the backbone of being a really effective speaker. When we don't know how to channel that emotion into our words, it often makes our voice quaver. It certainly did for me as a kid. I would be so overcome with sensation that my voice would quaver. Sometimes, I had a tongue thrust, so sometimes a lisp would come out and kids would laugh. And I find, again, that experience is very common. So it's being able to forgive ourselves for what transpired in the past, and also recognizing that no matter what kind of experience we had, how much of a mess we were, we actually need to tell those stories and share them, because it gives other people permission to speak their truth.
And do you have any tips around if you do have emotion coming into your story, like how to, you said like people usually don't know how to deal with it. Do you have any tips on how to deal with it?
You betcha. In terms of being able to work through that, the first thing is we know from neuroscience that the beliefs we carry around trigger the moment-to-moment thoughts that we have. And those moment-to-moment thoughts trigger the way we feel. And those feelings are not just I'm happy, I'm sad, I'm scared, I'm guilty. It's also the physiological sensation. And so if you have a thought that's a slightly lower level thought, such as, oh my gosh, there's all these people here, are they going to like me? Or is what I want to come out going to come out? A physiological response gets triggered, whether we like it or not. And that for some of us is the voice that gets a little wavy. So what I know to be true is that the first thing to do is to shut down the self-defeating thought, because if we stay in that thought, it's just going to trigger more and more sensation. So to be able to say kindly, how can I breathe? How can I focus on my audience? Because the truth is the minute you take the focus away from you and focus on who you're speaking to, your nervousness will go way down, because you cannot think about being of service and be thinking about yourself and how you might fail. It just doesn't work. And the second is to speak more quietly. So when you start to speak quietly and deliberately, and then slowly build in volume as your voice catches up, then your voice will get strong, and then you can continue on at whatever speed you're going to go.
For people listening, like this is super helpful, because I think everyone having a signature speech is extremely helpful, especially if you are doing anything to get business, like awesome. But I can see how this would be really powerful just in everyday communication too. Particularly the part about speaking quietly, because I know when I'm speaking quietly, for example, and slower, like I feel like I'm more connected to my body, more connected to my truth. So I think it just kind of works really well together. So it's a really great tip. Thank you. Who are the types of people that you normally work with?
These days, I'm really focused primarily on women or men who want to embrace their vulnerable side and who really have an element of feminine leadership in their speaking. And so it's funny to me, because the moment I got really clear that I was working primarily with women, most of whom are 2 or more years into their business, so they're really clear on who they're serving and what they're doing, and now the next step is being able to reach a larger audience, which speaking enables them to do. But then all these men showed up. We need men who harness this way of speaking. I believe in that wholeheartedly. So there's lots of men that I work with as well, but it tends to be a man who is so confident in his gender that he's ready to speak to transform people's lives and is not coming from a place of the masculine. And not to say that there's anything wrong with the masculine, it's just not me. So I'm not the best coach for someone who has that. I'm really good for people who want to speak their truth and do it so that it's of service for other people.
So, when you're talking with people about speaking their truth, obviously it's really vulnerable, it's hard. You've given some great tips on things they can do. Are there other like mindsets that you tell people to consider?
I ask people to think a lot about what they want an audience to do by the end of the time that they've spoken to them. Because what often happens is we think about what story are we going to open with, what idea are we going to introduce, how are we going to teach, and then how are we going to wrap up. And what happens when we do that is that much in the way we would design a program or a service where, we should be caring very deeply about user experience. But if we don't begin with the end in mind, we lose the user. Well, the same thing is true with an audience. We have to begin with the end in mind for them. How should they be thinking differently? But more importantly, what should they be set up to be able to do with the information that was shared? And once you get clarity on that, then you can identify what are the 2 or 3 main ideas that you want to communicate to ensure that an audience is set up to be in that place.
How do you get clear on what you want them to do at the end of it?
Really just by asking that question. So for example, if I'm giving a talk to an audience about how to use public speaking to build their business, let's say that by the end of that talk, I want people to be really clear on what is the story that they were born to tell, to be able to hang it on a core idea, and to know the 2 or 3 pieces of information that they're going to share. If that's what I know I'm talking about, then every story I tell, every anecdote I give, every question I ask has to take someone to that point. If it doesn't, then I have to let it go. So by asking that question and knowing your answer to it, it becomes a filter for everything else that you're going to weave together.
Interesting. So I said before that this is similar to like just regular speaking, but I guess in many ways it's also not, huh?
In my Influencer Academy, which is the primary way that I work with people in around all of their communication. So in that program, we look at negotiation, coaching, persuasion, thought leadership, and so forth, not just public speaking. It's really the same criteria, whether you're going to go in and ask for a raise or renegotiate rates with a client. The difference is you're going to utilize much more story, and you're probably going to use questions in a different way when you're speaking publicly than how you would if it was an interpersonal conversation that you were having.
And you've mentioned stories a couple of times. Do you have any tips on how to tell a great story?
Yes, I do. So I feel like I'm throwing a bunch of stuff at people. Hopefully it's useful without all of the context I would normally give it. I call it the 5 R's. The first piece is to identify what I call those come to Jesus moments that in the moment brought you to your knees, made you question, why me? Why am I having to go through this? Will I ever get through this? And that you come to recognize were integral for you being the person that you are. And the 5 R's come in by first recalling those, replaying them. So actually going through the details of what happened in those moments. What smells do you remember? What voices did you hear? What did the environment look like? What sounds did you hear? Bringing in all of those evocative details. That enables you then to be able to tell the story in such a way that it recreates that experience for an audience. The other R's, which we don't need to go through because, we could be here all day, but the next piece really is to reframe. And that's what's integral, so that a story doesn't just become about you, but the story, again, becomes about that audience. And it's to help show how you went from seeing that as a moment of struggle or an obstacle into it being an opportunity. So, for example, I will often ask people after I share one particular story around wearing headgear and being laughed at when I gave a speech, I'll say that for years, whenever I would get up to speak, I would say to myself, my voice is going to quaver, I'm going to stutter, people are going to laugh, and guess what happened? Exactly that. Sometimes they didn't laugh, but my voice pretty reliably did quaver. And so I'll ask people, what's the story that you've been carrying around about who you are as a speaker? And how's that working out for you? Or I might say, and how is that serving you and your message? And then I'll usually ask the third follow-up question. And if your answer is anything other than it is absolutely fueling me, it's time to let it go. Because whether it's right or not, it's getting you in your own way of doing the work you were put on this earth to do. And so I work with people to find the same way to do that with whatever the reframe is that they made, so that their audience can go through that same process, even if their circumstances are different.
Beautiful. Yeah, I have been asking you a lot of questions where you're giving tons of information, and while it's super, super helpful, I'd love to you know so much stuff, and that's why I've been asking you so many questions. You just have such a wealth of knowledge, and just as somebody who has accumulated so much knowledge and is the type of person you are, I'll also flip it back to asking questions about just the way that you're able to live your life now and be who you be. One thing I would love to know is what's a specific action step that you take to just have the high quality of life that you do?
It's so cliche, and yet it's so true that 90% of the time, because unfortunately I don't do anything 100% of the time short of breathe and drink water and eat. Well, sometimes eating even falls by the wayside on a really busy day. But what I do 90% of the time is I wake up and I give myself a minimum of 5 minutes to meditate. Sometimes that's a guided meditation that I listen to. Sometimes it's sitting on my cushion and just looking outside and keeping my eyes open, but just listening to my breath and allowing chatter to fall away. But I have to have that. I gave that to myself even in the postpartum time when I felt like I was only sleeping 2 hours a day. I made sure that at some point when my daughter was asleep that I would just do that. Because without that, I just find that there's so much noise. There's so much noise for me and I can't function with it. And so that helps tremendously. The other thing that I do, and we're blessed, you and I and other folks who live in great climates, is I get outdoors a lot. There's something about just walking into my backyard, looking at plants, whether it's winter and they're somewhat cold and there's not a lot going on, or it's the summer and things are blossoming, but just feeling that connection to the earth also really helps me. The other thing that I do, and this is kind of silly, but it's actually something that my coach, Natalie Lucy, talks about, and I never realized that this was probably a success strategy, but as someone who was a ballet dancer on the professional track for the first chapter of my life, I've just always danced. And I don't mean I take dance classes, because that definitely does not happen these days. But I'm known to be at my laptop and be dancing around it as I'm trying to come up with an idea for something, or certainly with my daughter, if we're eating, there's lots of dancing going around simultaneously. But I have to keep my body in motion, even if I'm not doing traditional exercise, because if my body just feels heavy, I find that my brain feels heavy and I don't do my best work, and I certainly don't feel my best.
So yeah, the dancing might only be a couple minutes, huh? But it still helps.
Absolutely. And it's usually throughout the day. So there's lots of times whenever I'm feeling stuck or frustrated, I know I just need to move my arms, move my legs, even if it's not pretty. Turn on a little bit of music and just feel the feminine inside of me coming alive again.
Beautiful. Something else I love to ask guests is just to kind of keep it real for people, just to help everyone know, you're still a real human with everyday struggles, and we never stop evolving. And I'd love to know what's something that right now you're currently working through in your life, and how are you getting through it?
I definitely think the trickiest thing that I'm working through right now is figuring out what is the balance or the integration going to be between work and the rest of my life. So I've started bringing somebody into my home who actually works for my business, but in a nanny capacity for 4 to 5 hours a week, just to see how I feel about that. Because as I keep dialing up what I'm doing professionally, I'm finding that there are moments when I'm checking email with my daughter in one arm. And while there's nothing inherently wrong with that, I like to be 100% present with her. And sometimes, no matter how many people I've hired over the last few months and how early I get up to work before she wakes up, I find that there's still been some slippage. So figuring out how to do that, especially when my husband has been having to travel a lot for work, which means I don't get a little break in the evening to get some more work done. I don't want to say that it's something that is causing a lot of strife, because fortunately it's not. But I know that what the day looks like right now is not sustainable long term. So trying to figure out what the right amount of time is to bring in some outside support and just sort of what that looks like. Because I love the fact that my daughter is used to being right next to me and there's a laptop there and I'm talking to her about doing work. I'm showing her videos that I might be working on for my training and having her feel like she's a part of what I'm doing. But with that said, she's still not even a year old. Like, she needs sometimes somebody else who's there with her.
Yeah, absolutely. Awesome. And for people now who are listening and maybe they're inspired by you and they love how much you're able to get your truth into the world, but still kind of scared to make changes in their own life, and either can be their life or their speaking, whatever you feel called to answer, but what advice would you give them?
Redefining what that feeling is huge. And for me, that sensation that I was definitely labeling fear for a long time was about building my team and bringing people in, not just as consultants that I would ship stuff out to, but like core members of a team who I'm in communication with every day, who are in communication with one another, operating like a real business. And the thing that kept coming up for me was, I can't afford it, or, oh my gosh, then I'm going to have to be a manager. And that's why I left working in a corporate environment, because I didn't want to manage. I wanted to be able to do the work that I love. When really the sensation that was coming up was what I call moxie, which is that sense of I'm on the cusp of doing something really big. But out of habit, I label that sensation fear and I try to push it down and try to not do anything with it. For people who might be having that sensation, but they're feeling really called to get to the other side of it, to remember that that sensation may not be fear, it may not be doubt. More likely than not, if you're on the cusp of doing something really big and gorgeous, it's just your body prepping. It's just your body revving up. Lean into that. Don't push through it, because pushing feels aggressive and violent. Be kind to yourself and just keep going, and recognize that a lot of really wise thought leaders have said this, and it's so true. If you ride any emotion 100%, at the end of it is joy. So whether it's fear you're riding, or whether it's anger you're riding, or anything else, allow yourself to be in it. Don't stuff it down, because true joy and life satisfaction is on the other side of it.
Wonderful advice. Thank you so much. And where can people go to learn more about you? I feel like you've given some really awesome information. People can get a really great sense about who you are. And I know you have amazing work you're putting out into the world. So where can people find that?
Yes, 2 places primarily. For folks who want to go through this free video training that you'd mentioned at the beginning to help them do this work, they can go to hotshotspeaker.com. And for those who want to learn more about my more robust program for those who are ready to both create but also pitch and ultimately perform their spotlight talks or their TED style talks, they can go to yourspotlighttalk.com.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for your time. This has been great.
My pleasure. Thank you for facilitating such exquisite conversations. You know this, but certainly people who are listening don't, that I just started listening to your podcast shortly before Jordana introduced us. And there's a lot of podcasts I listen to, and I love a lot of podcasts. There's something about yours, though, and your ability to ask questions that allow people to talk about themselves in a way that they don't often get to, and to be able to share what goes on behind closed doors in their minds and in their hearts while giving business tips is just such a beautiful thing. So thank you for doing the work you do, Rachel.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much for listening to A Better Life. You can find all show notes for this episode at rachelroffe.com. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe so you can automatically get access to all new shows. Let's also connect. Just go onto Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram /Rachel Roffe, and we can talk there. The opinions of all guests here are their own, and I'm not necessarily endorsing any of them. I do want to give you perspective though, and always